The African American Civil Rights Movement occurred between the mid to late 1960s, and it was a period of major reform for greater equality for between blacks and whites. The March on Washington took place in 1963, and over 200,000 people from civil rights groups to clergy to religious groups attended this march, and many civilians observed. This march was huge and gained media attention all over America. The march was a very beneficial strategy for the civil rights movement. During this march, Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. He was a huge face of the African American civil rights movement and a major supporter of nonviolence. He preached for blacks to take the calm and peaceful way of approaching things and explained that even though slavery was banned, Africans still weren't free. And he explained this logically and calmly. Discrimination and prejudice were very much alive, and he wanted the nation to hear it. This shows that, speakers and the speeches aired nationally, combined with their message of nonviolence, provided a very strong foundation to gain supporters for this movement. Here, the SNCC, also known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is doing a sit-in. They would sit there and wait until they were served. No force was used, and nobody had any intention of harming anyone. Again, they used this strategy and tactic of nonviolence to their benefit, and their piece spoke loudly against the white supremacists and discrimination and the Jim Crow laws. Having said that, not all the groups in this movement thought that nonviolence was the path to take. The Black Panther Party was a nationalist group that advocated the use of more force and violence than the sit-ins and the speeches given by Martin Luther King. They carried rifles around and were intimidating. They didn't see nonviolence as an option because it seemed like when they did sit back and watch, their people were getting killed and abused by the police and the government. This police brutality led them to fight back, and they weren't going to fight back with just words. The Black Panther Party released this program seen here with all sorts of demands. One demand stated, "We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community." They basically wanted to stop being abused by the government and wanted equality. Their intimidation tactics were recognized and did work to some extent, although it was seen as much more controversial than the nonviolence tactics and the sit-ins used by Martin Luther King and the SNCC. The LGBT movement is in fact still a very alive movement to this day. Just recently, gay marriage was legalized, and the transition of Caitlyn Jenner has gained widespread awareness and brought this awareness to the transgender community. Back then, however, it was not a very popular topic, and a lot of people were still trying to understand what homosexuality was. Alfred Kinsey, an American biologist, brought to light that homosexuality was not just this black and white thing. He said it wasn't a mental illness and that people should stop labeling it as such. In his book, Sexual Behavior of the Human Male, he introduced a scale of sexuality, 0 being very heterosexual and 6 being homosexual. Many people were shocked and found it extremely controversial. Alfred Kinsey, however, he brought a scientific perspective to the topic. The other movements did not have the privilege of using this scientific edge. So the LGBT community took the scientific edge and used it as a strategy to support their cause. One of the main events that triggered national awareness and the rise of homophile groups for this LGBT community was the Stonewall riot. The police came into this bar and humiliated and crucified these gay men. There was no foul play or harm that gave the police any real reason to come in and attack, but they did, and the rest of America was watching. After the raid, protests were lined up and down the streets of New York, and people watched as police abused their authority over these innocent, gay men and drag queens who were innocent human beings. The LGBT community was able to use this riot as a platform to spread awareness. It sparked the rise of many homophile groups that advocated gay rights and would picket outside the White House and conduct protests. One way that connected the African American and LGBT community at this time was that they were objectified and brutalized by the government. All they wanted was equality. Both groups, although of different origin, had very similar goals. They wanted fair economic opportunity, an end to employment discrimination, an end to housing discrimination, and an end to overall social discrimination. Feminism was an issue since before the 1900s. During the Progressive Era, women were finally able to get the right to vote. But as the 1900s progressed, other issues came up and women started fighting for a truer equality. Being given the right to vote made them look more equal on paper, but did not cause them to be treated more equally in real life, similarly to how blacks were given rights on paper, but very much discriminated in everyday world. Women didn't want to be classified under this MRS degree or housewife. They didn't want to be trapped under these childbearing obligations anymore, but instead wanted growth and wanted the opportunity to gain a sense of fulfillment that society would not permit. These statistics show that the struggle was real and women are being paid significantly less than men. And if you were a non-white woman, you dealt with racial and gender prejudice. Even to this day, women do not get paid as much as men, although the income gap is extremely small now. Women did sit-ins similar to the African American Civil Rights Movement. And this was one of their strategies and a very smart strategy that got them results. In the Ladies' Home Journal sit-in 1970, shown here, at least 100 women marched in and sat for 11 hours. They demanded a woman needed to be in charge of this magazine production. They demanded free daycare for their children. They demanded increased wages. And they wanted the magazine to stop portraying women in a degrading light. They didn't get everything they demanded, but they did end up getting to write a section of the magazine. And this got national recognition. It was a win for them. Another strategy that women used to support this movement was their maternal component. The Women Strike for Peace, women used their roles as mothers to call for an end to the nuclear arms race. It was a one-day strike in 1951, and about 50,000 women participated. This was huge. They were able to use their feminine or motherly side to gain empathy for their sons and children. At the end of the day, the feminism movement shared many common goals with the African American Civil Rights Movement. Women wanted to gain equality for their everyday lives, not just on paper, and wanted to end job discrimination. The feminism movement was successful as the income gap between men and women is very small, and you see a lot of women in managerial positions that you would not have seen back then. In most households, women do work and are able to hold their own. Having said this, the most successful movement out of all three movements was the African Civil Rights Movement, the African American Civil Rights Movement. This is because America has gone from slavery to Jim Crow laws to an African American president. Some would even say that there's reverse prejudice now. African Americans have seen the greatest reduction in discrimination out of all three of these groups. The least successful movement would probably be the LGBT movement, as that movement is still very much alive today, more alive than the other two movements, and it's made the least progress. Many people still don't accept homosexuality or transgender, and since the LGBT community is so much smaller than the African American community or the women population, it's a lot harder for them to gain support and traction across the nation like the other two movements.